Vlad doesn't have any extra screens. So, Joseph, I joked last week that we might have the fewest screens that we've ever had to do the show because Vlad doesn't have his 6 set of screen command monitor set up, but he borrowed one last week. So I am guessing that now officially we have the smallest number of screens on a manufacturing hub show, which is impressive in and of itself. But no, awesome. I am waiting to see us live. I would imagine that we're live. I'm showing that we're live now, so I'll say hi to everyone. If you guys are new to Manufacturing Hub, welcome. If you guys have been here before, welcome back. What we do like to do is give everyone a couple of minutes to go ahead and jump in. I'll give everyone a bit of a rundown, and you'll hear me say it at least once more if you make it all the way through the show with us live here today. We are generally an open conversation show. We love community comments, and we love to go and do our very best to go bring those comments in. So if you are watching live and would like to ask questions to Joseph, or I suppose Vlad and myself, about about ITOT convergence, our current theme on Manufacturing Hub, please go for it. We like those extra jolts of energy, and maybe never knowing what that question is going to be next. At least I enjoy it. I think it probably stresses Vlad out a little bit, and we've never actually asked our guests their feelings on it, and but we certainly do have fun with it. I will also go ahead and welcome everyone from Solus PLC. Joseph, you probably know Vlad runs Solus PLC. Big YouTube channel, coming up on 37,000 subscribers. And Vlad never asks people to subscribe to his own YouTube channel, so it's on me to ask people to subscribe to his own YouTube channil. At the
Thanks,
beginning,
Dave.
go. Absolutely. I also like to take complete credit for all of his hard work. But what are friends for if not for that? Absolutely. Before we go ahead and jump in, one last thing, would like to thank Siemens for sponsoring the ITOT convergence theme, as well as your continued support of Manufacturing Hub and the manufacturing and automation communities in general. And without further ado, everyone, officially welcome to Manufacturing Hub. I am Dave. This guy up here is Vlad. We have a really special guest on episode 3 of ITOT Convergence, Joseph Dolivo. Joseph, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Dave and Vlad. Great to be here. Looking forward to a great discussion today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today, Joseph. Really appreciate your time. Before we dive into the ITOT convergence, could you give us a bit of a synopsis of your background? How did you get started in manufacturing and automation, and what it is that you are doing today?
Absolutely. So I started out, I remember in grade school, my first sort of electronics experience I remember was taking a Sega Genesis controller and plugging it to my parents' old Commodore 64 and frying it. And I was like, well, it fits, but evidently it's not electrically compatible. So that's probably when I realized that I should be more in software than hardware. But I ended up going to school to do an electrical engineering degree, and I ended up specializing in software. And I remember my first job out of school was working as a system integrator, and I had a PLC in front of me, and I was learning ladder logic. And I just remember thinking, why can't I just write an if statement? Why do I have to put these XICs and XIOs and OTEs, and I have to have a nested parallel branch, and I was like, why can't I just write code? And that was, of course, before I both learned that structured text was a thing, but also gained an appreciation for what ladder logic is and the history and what it came from. So I was working as a system integrator, and I very quickly found myself more on the SCADA and above side of things. So I did a lot of implementations, specifically with a lot of the Allen Bradley and Rockwell software. Sorry, Siemens wasn't exposed to that until later. And then eventually came upon Ignition, which as a software person really resonated with me, because I was like, oh, I have this software that can connect to all these devices, but it also supports Python programming, Jython technically, and would be this nice environment for me to do all this kind of stuff. And that really opened doors into kind of working my way up the OSI stack, if you will, and the ISA95 stack into MES. And I did a whole bunch of MES implementations, focusing on ERP integration. Ended up doing a lot of stuff with SAP. And I'd like to say that I'm not an SAP consultant, but I know more about SAP than I ever wanted to. Did a lot of that kind of integration, partnering with the company Sepasoft in the Ignition ecosystem to develop a business connector suite, which is still out there and still a great best-in-class means of doing connectivity. And fast forward to today, spun off from doing system integration to being in the same ecosystem in the same space, but with a startup company called 4IR Solutions that really looks at providing managed cloud and hybrid cloud infrastructure for OT systems. And I'll tell you, when I heard the topic about IT/OT convergence, this is actually a perfect discussion topic for what we're doing right now, because we're seeing this conversion. It's been happening since I started in the industry, and I think what encapsulates IT and OT in this conversation, at least for me, has quite evolved. So that brings me to where I'm at today, building some products and managed services in this space.
Oh boy, Joseph, I wish I had a notepad, and wrote down all the questions. I think, again, as I always say, we can go in many different directions. Very early on, I think like what caught my eye is that you mentioned that you had to switch, from maybe the traditional programming that you were taught into ladder logic. I wanted to maybe just explore that a little bit very briefly. Do you still think in, traditional programming, or did you switch to ladder logic? Because in my mind, when I program PLCs or I program PLCs, I always still go back to C. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, that transition, and how do you think when you build software today?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I'll kind of relate it to just speaking languages, right? So if you're a native speaker with one language, I think depending on how long you spend learning a second language, you might always be doing kind of that manual
Yep.
translation. But I know, my wife, for example, is multilingual, and now she will actually have dreams in English, for example. And so I feel like I never stayed close enough to the PLCs where I started thinking in PLC language, if you will. So C, C++, that was really my mental model. And that continues to be my mental model for languages I work with now, which are sort of from that same, family, spanning from that. So I never quite made the transition. Although, like I said, I have had an appreciation for it, especially understanding the history of relay logic and how it's geared toward folks who didn't have a formal computer science or software engineering background. So definitely appreciate that.
It,
Curious with your answer to that question as well, Vlad, and certainly you, Dave, too.
I guess in my perspective, like I said, I still think more in C, right? Because that's
Yep.
ultimately what I learned in university before being exposed to ladder logic, and I still translate in my head back to C what it would be in my case. But I'm always curious, what's the best approach? Is it to learn ladder logic and then being exposed to these higher level languages, as you said, climbing the stack maybe, or vice versa, learning the languages and then being exposed to PLC? But it's interesting how different people approach that problem. Dave?
Yeah, I guess as I'm sure Vlad knows, and I would imagine most of the people listening, I wasn't necessarily I wasn't a programmer, right? But before I got into and continued to be in automation and manufacturing, it was more of, for me, kind of a means to the end. And so I guess when I think about lots of programming like machines, I guess I learned ladder logic before I learned anything else, and I kind of take it back to all of the relays and the timers. And I guess my technical background is in aviation, and so I spent a
Mhm.
lot of time working on really old hardware, well, new but very old style hardware. And so I think about it in some cases in that, and I think a lot about it in more of kind of like object oriented programming of let's just go drag blocks into places. But that's more of like my ideal form of the world. But as Vlad knows, I also don't do a lot of programming, which is probably much better that I don't do it for literally everyone whose facility I have ever been in, and especially worked in the last half a dozen years or so.
Yeah.
There's a
Uh,
comment in chat. Jane said that she thinks in assembly. I think that's a little bit extreme. I've done assembly in university, but boy, that's a hard one for me. But anyways, Joseph, maybe moving on to the transition into the higher layers, right? So, what was that like? Did you voluntarily make that transition? Were there projects? How did that happen, right? Like your interest with SCADA, MES. I'm also curious about how you kind of transitioned from doing maybe integration work into those higher level systems.
Yeah, totally. And I know, I was fortunate enough to be put on projects where that was an opportunity for me. And I remember one in particular was it was a combination of I was using RS Logix 5000 for the PLC program, and then RSV 32,
Hmm.
which is it sounds old to me. I know some folks have been working with software from way before that. But that started to introduce the concept of not just an HMI, if you will, where I'm kind of dragging graphics around, but it had a whole programming backend
Hmm.
behind it. So that was like, oh, I could sort of do programming in here. That's interesting. Do I want to have a whole bunch of code behind these screens? Is that considered a best practice? Probably not. But it sort of opened my eyes, I think, to what was possible. And then it's funny. It was exactly 10 years ago to this year, where I went back and found an email that I had sent to a colleague asking about what's this ignition platform that I hear people talking about. It looks kind of neat. That was the word that I said was neat. But all of a sudden, this idea of a let's say an OT IDE sort of sprung up, and I was like, wow, now this is like a real programming model with a real scripting API, and I have the ability to do that. And I started making a push internally, actually, to start adopting ignition for projects where we as an integrator, and you guys know a lot of times you're beholden to customer preferences, to standards, to vendors that'll bring you into opportunities. But where I had the opportunity, I started basically bringing in ignition, and I ended up being the first certified ignition programmer for the SI that I worked for at the time, and kind of became
Really?
an internal champion for that. So that was pretty neat. And I guess from that point on, I never really went back. I've still interfaced with PLCs, and I mean that's a big focus of my what I do today is the data that's generated is coming from PLCs and DCSs, right? So we have to get at that data.
Mhm.
But it's been less about the control and more about interfacing to it, and then bringing it into the world where, frankly, I'm just much more comfortable, and I feel more well versed in that space. So that's kind of how that started out.
I'm curious, in your perspective, again, like maybe making that jump from not necessarily maybe just control systems, but some of the other SCADA platforms that are available to Ignition. Do you think that do you see people making that jump easier? Do you think that there's quite of a learning curve? Do you think that it's a lot, because I know they have a really good university at the very least and a really good program where you can get certified. So I think they offer a lot of tools to get up to speed, but are you seeing people maybe struggle with it? Do you see people really embrace it? What are your thoughts on getting into Ignition?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've seen a balance of it for sure. I'll say, for example, for folks that may not be familiar with it, back in the last major release of Ignition, which was 8.0, they released a whole new visualization engine that basically runs in the browser. So it's
Mhm.
HTML5 screens, and what that brought with you was a requirement for understanding HTML, CSS, a little bit about JavaScript because that's running in the background. And I know that, for example, has created a lot of challenges for, let's say, traditional automation folks who are used to working, at a fixed width screen in software
Mhm.
like USE or in Wonderware or something more traditional. And there's a huge learning curve in doing that right. What I've also seen is that it's also been a door opener for folks who may not traditionally be looking at the automation space, but who maybe have a web development background or an IT background or a software background. And from what I've seen in talking with some of the folks at IA from the education side, that's actually attracted new folks into automation who may otherwise, may not have paid attention to it. So I think it's actually a little bit of both. But if you're coming from a traditional background, you're working with a fixed ratio, screen resolution, and all of that, I think it's quite a heavy lift. The inductive university is good. Training courses are pretty good. But of course, there's no substitute for doing actual project work, which I was fortunate enough to be in a position to do that. So that's kind of my perspective on, no pun intended, on perspective at Ignition.
Yeah, that's look. I really like what they did, right? Because I think, as you said, it brings people from other disciplines. I've had a little bit of experience through the iOS platform. So if you use Xcode and you develop like some of the Swift apps, they use a very
Yep.
similar
Mhm.
model. Like when everything can be resized from different iPhones, different iPads, and I think I don't know if that's where they got inspired from, but I know a lot of platforms kind of have that same way of creating your graphics and kind of rearranging things on screen. So I could see how it's difficult, if you have experience on the Rockwell tools, but certainly if you come from that background, it can be a lot easier, which is again, I don't have the stats on that, but it's really interesting.
I
Totally.
was gonna say. I was going to say, if I can just throw a counterpoint to it, and I generally agree with everything Joseph is saying. I guess Ignition being an IDE is really nice because you can do anything with it, but the downside is you can do anything with it. And then as we move into HTML, it's basically just straight HTML programming. I guess before that, I saw a lot of really ugly Ignition systems. After that, I've seen some things that look like websites from 1997. So I absolutely agree with Joseph's statement. It's a very powerful tool. And I've certainly seen other software engineers, computer engineers, computer scientists make that transition. It makes it easy. I actually know and work with a couple of groups who basically just sketch out what they want the screen to look like, and they just hand it over to literal web developers that they have, and the web developers do that. I kind of, as an ecosystem as a whole, I'm actually really happy with what I've seen in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. I think kind of one of the big kind of software releases that I was impressed with was Siemens WinCC OA, the open architecture.
Mhm.
There are a number of projects, a couple of them that I was involved in, that got released into the US, and that is very clean. It's very clean, very modern, allows you to kind of go program whatever it is you'd like. And so I really like that. And I like some of the slightly more rigid functions that they have built in. It helps more traditional folks. I know that they've got a unified, I think they call it unified. I have not personally worked with the Siemens unified. And then I guess so I'm happy with the direction that I've seen a number of systems go, to bring in people who aren't going to, well, to bring in people to allow you to make HMI and SCADA and other screens look like it's from, the early 2000s or the 2020s, as opposed to 1994. When I think of what we're coming away from, I guess my mind always goes back to like the wonderware of like the 90s, and how it was revolutionary when it came out. But now you look at it literally 30 years later and you wonder how we're still running the things that were, peak 30 years ago. So to Joseph's point, a lot of really good opportunities. But as we give people more opportunities to do other things, it just increases the level of difficulty and the level of skill in order to get something out the door, much less in order to get something good looking out the door.
Totally agree. And I'll echo your comment, Dave, that I think, I haven't worked with WinCC myself, but I've heard good things about it. And it's nice to see a convergence, if you will. If we're going to use that word a little bit on this podcast, I think, but kind of this convergence of, visualizations that all these platforms are moving to, alongside, great power comes great responsibility. So I think we're seeing that as well when you have to support multiple form factors. But again, even something like that is kind of driven by necessity now, where I want to be able to pull up data on my phone or on my tablet. And I expect data to be in a format that makes sense for me when I want it, where I want it. And that means you got to design for multiple form factors.
Joseph, you mentioned briefly what you do today, but could you expand a little bit more maybe on 4IR? What kind of solutions do you provide? Maybe what kind of stack do you work with? What's the overall kind of goal of the current company?
Yeah, totally. So we do managed cloud infrastructure, and a lot of times people say, well, the cloud, I don't want to touch the cloud. I don't want data leaving my four walls. But it sort of speaks to, I think, we talk about IT/OT convergence, and I remember, again, when I started out, to me that meant we've got Ethernet cables we're plugging into PLCs, and we're using Ethernet IP and TCP/IP or UDP based protocols, as opposed to ControlNet, DeviceNet, and some of those legacy ones. But now for me, what that really means is taking other technologies and techniques from the IT and the software world, like version control, like offsite backup strategies, like DevOps, if you will, where you have multiple environments and change control, and bringing those technologies to the OT space, which has historically kind of not really been there. So containerization is another big one. So what we've basically tried to do is to take these best practices that have been figured out by large IT companies and make those digestible and available to folks in the OT space without them necessarily having to worry about how to do it, but they can still get the benefits from it. So case in point, we have two managed service products one's called Factory Stack, which is sort of our catch-all offering aimed at any manufacturing or energy producing companies. And then we have PharmaStack, which basically builds on Factory Stack and is geared specifically towards pharmaceutical and other life science companies. And we provide you a managed private infrastructure. So it could be a segment of the cloud. It could be something running on an on-prem hybrid edge device in a plant. And we run Ignition and I'll say ancillary or sort of assistive software alongside of that for you. So you focus on building your application and making what it is that you want to do. And we handle the upkeep of it, the monitoring, the version control, the backups, putting in guardrails, if you will, for best practices, a database, pre-configuring database connections, and all that kind of stuff. So giving you all the building blocks and tools you need to run a highly secure performance solution without you having to manage all the underlying plumbing, if you will, yourself. So if that makes sense.
And so you mentioned both on-prem or in cloud, right? So you can do either deploying on servers that are going to be inside the facility or a cloud-based solution.
Yep, exactly right. So we can deploy it purely in the cloud, and Ignition is uniquely suited. There's other platforms now as well that are moving into this space, but I remember the first sort of prototype for what is now the Factory Stack product was something I was building on top of the Docker container version that Ignition Inductive made available for Ignition and running it locally. And it was this really nice way for folks who may or may not know, but containers are a really nice way of packaging up software alongside the dependencies that are needed to run it and being able to deploy that in multiple different environments. So you're able to now take Ignition, sort of connect in configuration details, and then run it in an environment in the cloud. You can also do it on premise. You can do it on an edge device. You can do it in sort of a hybrid cloud environment, which means I've got some big industrial server, and I've carved off some space on that into which I want to be able to deploy applications and, kind of orchestrate it across multiple VMs and stuff like that. So that really is, kind of how, let's say, Factory Stack started off, and then building in other software that also has similar IT focused technologies that they've been adopting that makes it possible for us to even do this in the first place. Because for example, a lot of legacy software, not only does it not support containers, it doesn't have a good way of, let's say, backing it up necessarily, or they have very manual backup processes, or they're running only on Windows when you have to go through, a Patch Tuesday and do updates and all this kind of stuff. So the software isn't necessarily geared for doing that kind of thing, whereas software like Ignition does do things like that.
And Joseph, if I can, I guess, ask you to expand just a little bit more. So for someone who's not, I guess, that familiar with the Ignition maybe ecosystem, so something that's going to go on-prem typically is going to be used more of like a SCADA, right? So you can control the lines, the production on the plant floor, versus if you're sending data to the cloud, that's going to be more for like an MES type of an application where you're going to do some data analysis. Maybe you're going to be showing this data, to somebody remotely, or could you paint us a picture of what both of those use cases look like, and ultimately maybe a few problems that they may solve over the traditional deployments?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, a lot of companies, for example, if I'm a smaller manufacturer, I've got maybe a single site. Historically, you would maybe buy a rack server, an industrial PC, install it on site. You'll install your SCADA software, your MES software on there that'll kind of run your plant. Sooner or later, that server is going to require, in fact, at all times, it's going to require updates and upgrades. And what we found is a lot of, OT staff don't necessarily have the bandwidth to be able to do that. Or it's you've got Windows XP boxes that are unpatched, and once in a while you could get away with that because unless somebody plugged in a USB stick with ransomware, which does and has happened, by the way, you could expect that if your network was air gapped, your risk was a little bit lower. Nowadays, it's not good enough to just have your data just residing in the plants. Like I mentioned, you've got folks working from home. You want to be able to access that. So connectivity to higher level systems, whether they're running in a custom, a big enterprise's private data center or in the cloud, becomes really, really critical. So the first kind of use case, if you will, is extracting data from these systems and being able to access that outside of the plant in a way that is critically very, very secure. And now you take that one step up from, let's say, a small manufacturer or an individual site to, let's say, an enterprise. And now I've got, multiple different sites. Maybe I'm a very large enterprise that's had a bunch of M&As, and I'm trying to consolidate a lot of different technology platforms, build kind of a unified data model, be able to compare my manufacturing data across multiple sites. And I need, kind of an enterprise level system that can do that and be centrally managed, but run locally so that I'm not dependent upon a always up cloud connection to do that. So again, Ignition and similar tools work for cases like that, where I can have basically an edge node, which is going to allow me to provide my, perform my local control operations locally, but also act as a data conduit using things like store and forward up to a cloud instance where I could have my, my cloud database, or maybe my data warehouse, or my data lake, or my analytics tools, or my Power BI or Tableau visualization tools, all running in the cloud. So it solves kind of that problem of saying, hey, I need some level of standardization across all these different sites, but I also can't not control my plants because I lose connectivity to the cloud. I need to have account, and I can't lose data, especially if I'm in a regulated industry where, the FDA is going to require that I'm sampling, certain data points every 15 minutes exactly, for example, right? So those are some of the use cases that we're taking care of, while not requiring folks to spend time they don't have to manage and maintain and patch and upgrade all of that infrastructure at the plant. Hopefully that helps
And
paint
there's
a bit of a picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot that goes into that. I like the summary, but there's a lot of hardware and software that kind of makes that entire stack possible, right? And certainly if you're interested in this, I will make a mental note as well to any listeners who may not be familiar with all the systems to reach out to Joseph. We'll have those links if you're listening to this in audio form, on the drive. It's going to be on manufacturinghub.live, so you can certainly send him a message if you would like to learn more. Because again, I think we can only cover so much in this short period of time, but there's a lot of technology that can help in many different ways. Like, and I can give you one example. I've been to this facility that, again, as you mentioned, for regulatory purposes, needed to store temperatures for a batch process, right? And so they were using a local machine for for very, how to say it, the questionable reasons. It would go down, it would get full with data, and they would lose the FDA regulated information every other week or so. And so by implementing a solution like you've just described, they can send that data very reliably, they can review it, they can then trace it back. So it becomes a lot easier in many ways. But no, if you want to learn more, certainly reach out to Joseph. But on the IT and OT side, Joseph, I think that you certainly get in many discussions. I'm not going to ask you how heated those discussions get, but I'm curious, what's the immediate maybe or some of the reactions that you get on the IT side? Is it fear? Are they cautious? Are they concerned about certain specific things, right? Is it cybersecurity that concerns them the most? Is it kind of allowing that conduit of data? Is it not knowing what's coming on the OT side? Like, what are some of the initial thoughts when you maybe do an assessment with a client and you propose a solution to them?
It's a great question, Vlad, and it's kind of funny because my answer has changed to that over the years. And I'll say 4 or 5 years ago, this is right when I was working heavily in sort of the SAP integration space, like we talked about. And
Mhm.
that's a very similar use case where we've got plant floor data. We have to connect up to SAP, which is the single source of truth for many companies, the system of record, the financial and accounting system. So that is always a heavily regulated IT system. And we were having to make the case, and continue to do so all the time, to say we need access to the system. We'd have to go through, we have a connector that's certified. Here's how we do it. Here's the interface we use. And so people would kind of come to us being, I don't want to say defensive, but rightfully inquisitive. And then we would be able to answer questions to kind of help them understand why this was okay. And I'll say again, even in that time frame 4 or 5 years ago, if you were to mention the cloud, people would say, I don't trust the cloud. I don't trust cloud providers. I don't trust you. I don't trust. And funnily enough, something that did happen during the pandemic was we had customers that were starting to ask us for this kind of a thing. And again, it started off with saying, I need access to data, and then it started out saying, well, you know what? I don't really want to drive down to the plants to go maintain this server. I want somebody else to do it for me. So a greater acceptance of kind of managed services. And so we've actually had customers that, historically wouldn't have wanted to touch the cloud with a 39-foot pole, are now asking us about it. And what's funny about that too is The technologies that we're using, so we're talking about version control with Gits. We're talking about CI/CD pipelines for doing deployments. We're talking about having dev, test, and staging environments. These concepts, we say these to the IT folks, they actually get it. So they're actually very encouraged by this because, and you look at, I keep coming back to SAP because I spend so much time with that. SAP has been pushing a lot of folks into cloud hosted solutions. So a lot of manufacturers who are going to run all their OT stuff still on premise, for example, they're already having their SAP system in the cloud, and their IT folks are already involved in that. So I'm actually seeing a lot more acceptance of this because they're like, oh yeah, we're speaking the same language. You want to connect to our Apache Kafka broker? Oh yeah. We already have a means of doing this. So it's been a surprise, and like I said, it's definitely been a shift in the conversations we've had over the past couple of years, partially driven by the pandemic and digital transformation and everything else in that realm. Curious from your guys' perspective what you've seen as well there.
Dave?
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of laughing at your comment about 4 or 5 years ago, Joseph, because I distinctly remember I was at an automation fair. I was sitting listening, and someone basically asked a very similar question, right to these senior executives at automation fair, and at least one of their answers were, "Hey, we work in a highly regulated industry." I don't remember if it was pharma or some sort of medical or medical device, and they're like, "For us, we don't even know if we could, in theory, mirror our data up to the cloud and then be able to use it, if only for internal things. We don't even know if we wouldn't have to go back through re-verifying everything, which is just a terrible pain within their systems." And I remember thinking to myself, if there may be some industries who have extra cause for pause, but before moving to the cloud. But at some point, if you're unwilling to look at solutions that you can only install via CD-ROM, you're going to run out of laptops that you can buy that have CD-ROM drives in them, right? So I think that it's been very interesting to watch as things change. And I think that we are absolutely going to continue to see that. I think that there will absolutely be laggards. Like I think the conversations that we've generally been having all month long is that to a large extent, IT/OT convergence has already been determined, right? Like we are either going to combine the stack, we are either going to all be on one team, or companies are going to struggle significantly into the future if they are unwilling to go and utilize these tools. But that is not necessarily what we see in many of these facilities. So I'm sure 20, 30, 40% of them are going to be the laggards who are going to only be drug into IT/OT convergence, cloud solutions, and other things when their core vendors refuse to send them CD-ROMs, when the core vendors refuse to offer things that don't include managed services and offerings to that like.
Yeah, what's funny about that, Dave, is we talk about the cloud, and I think sometimes people will picture it as kind of an all or nothing approach. So I'm just gonna have my my 5G gateways in the plants, and everything's gonna run in the cloud. And I think that future, maybe that's possible with 6 or 7G. I don't think we're anywhere near that yet. But what it really is a bit of a spectrum, if you will. And so right now, for example, as my colleague James would say, companies are taking their tape drive backups down to the bank vault, or maybe they're not. The cloud and the scalability and elasticity that you get makes total sense for just doing backups. So you can adopt it in a piecemeal way. And again, companies have been doing this with other software, specifically in the IT space, for a very long time. So the discussion isn't, hey, I got to take all my stuff running in the plants and put it all in the cloud. It's, can I start to use the cloud for things that the cloud is good at? Things like backups, things like centralized identity management, things like governance and policies and elasticity and scalability. So if I need to, for example, I want to spin up a dev system to run some tests, do I have to go buy a new physical server with lead times because of the supply chain problems being what they are, just to do some testing? Or can I spin something up dynamically, do my testing, and then tear it down when I don't need it, and not have to pay that ongoing cost or absorb a big capital cost? So that's where I think we'll see more and more gradual adoption. And to your point, there will continue to be laggards, I think, but I think we'll see that curve, if you will, shifting more to the right, albeit in maybe a piecemeal way.
Yeah, I was
Let
gonna make
me
the Go ahead, Dave. Go
I
ahead.
was going to say, let me ask the follow up on that, Joseph. So 4 or 5 years ago, for most groups, cloud kind of outside of the realm of consideration. Fast forward to today, kind of post everything that we've gone through with the pandemic. What are those conversations looking like when you're like, "Hey, I'm Joseph. We offer managed cloud services." I would imagine that there's some percentage of groups that are like, "Yes, absolutely, we're on board." Are the kind of probably large middle? Is there as much fight as there was 5 years ago? How are those conversations going, and is it easier to win people over?
Yeah, there it's definitely easier. And it comes with, kind of the asterisks, if you will. So if we come in and say we offer a cloud service, we
Hmm.
have to qualify that. And so again, the cloud, besides being a buzzword, it implies a lot of things and suggests a lot of technologies which maybe aren't, I have a shirt that I thought about wearing, but I didn't, but it says like there is no cloud, it's just somebody else's computer. So that is, I love that shirt. That is what the cloud is, if you will. But alongside the cloud are these concepts of like infrastructure as code, for example. And so what we're able to do with our platform, and other folks are doing this too, is that we can have source code that basically states what my infrastructure needs to look like. And that can be the
Hmm.
case in a cloud, but that could also be the case on premise. And so my disaster recovery, my business continuity strategy can be, well, you know what, because I have all this stuff in source code, I can track changes between this, and I have the ability to tear down what's at the plant and rebuild it from scratch, instead of me having this sort of, maybe this old VM or this old bare metal server that I have to constantly kind of care and feed. So it really changes the game. And when we qualify that and we say, hey, we're bringing this managed cloud service to you, it doesn't even have to run in the cloud. We can do all of our orchestration and governance from our own, management plane in the cloud per se. But your workloads are running locally. Your data is not leaving the site. You're getting remote access provided to you if and only if you need it. And that is a much, I'll say, easier pill to swallow for a lot of folks who, to your point, Dave, otherwise would have maybe been kind of pushing it away. So the cloud is sort of, there's a lot of things that I think come with that definition that we have to qualify. But when we do qualify it, folks are like, oh yeah, I totally get it. I definitely like that.
Yeah, I was gonna
So
mention, I guess, like in my experience, I certainly don't think that we should be on the bleeding edge, when it comes to a lot of these technologies. But I certainly think that there's a lot of room to improvement, at least for the larger customers, to sort of at least explore the different options, right? And sort of maybe not necessarily migrate their entire infrastructure into the cloud. I don't think that that's even an option, but at the very least, start conducting tests and sort of trying smaller applications where they can leverage the cloud in order to see the benefits. And I think, like, for me, at least in my experience, that has been kind of the tipping point, right? Like, once they see that it is secure, it is not as again as resource intensive as a local server. It doesn't take, as you said, 6 months, 8 months to arrive. It doesn't require as much maintenance. And again, like in those smaller project wins, they start to implement more and more. But I still see, some reluctance, and obviously the we've always done it this way comes back fairly often. But with younger plants, right? Like any plant that has been
Hmm.
started in the last like 5, 10 years, I think they have a connection to the cloud. They could not have done it otherwise, right? And they see that advantage. They see the ability to remote into their site, to view the data, and to be a lot more reactive in many ways. And so um, those sites have adopted cloud, remote data a lot more, how to say it, with a lot less reluctance. So
totally. I think an example of something too, which is again, it's sort of in the realm of cloud, but there's a concept or a technology called hyperconverged infrastructure, which is a really big word. But what it means is you're taking your computes, which historically would be like a PC or maybe a virtual
Hmm.
machine, your networking and your storage, and it all becomes software defined. So I could buy this box, right? And there's a bunch of companies that offer these HCI infrastructure, and I can basically take my traditional workloads, which maybe ran on, a standalone industrial PC, which again, maybe nobody's patching, or maybe a server in a server rack somewhere, or maybe I've got something on a DIN rail inside of a panel. But I can take these applications as they are, these traditional applications that run on bare metal or run in virtual machines, and I can just consolidate all of those into into one box or a pair of redundant boxes, for example, for redundancy. But now I've consolidated sort of these single points of failure, and I'm not fundamentally changing the architecture, if you will. I'm not having to re-architect these applications to be, cloud native or be microservices or any of this kind of stuff. It's also running, in the plans, but it's sort of a gateway, if you will, to adopting these other technologies. And that's something where, again, we've seen a much greater appetite for, because it's not as big and scary as moving my applications off site. But it's an interesting gateway, I think, into that world. Have you guys seen that or heard from that or looked at companies providing those kind of systems as well? It's going to be like companies like Stratus, for example, has boxes there, edge devices. The cloud providers have, these hardware devices like the Azure Stack Edge or the AWS Snow series, where you just lease this hardware for, I think in Azure's case, it's like $500 a month. And then you could just deploy your applications on there. You pay monthly for it. And then if there's a problem, they'll ship you a new one. Or when you're done with it, you kind of ship it back. But it's this sort of semi-managed hardware that you could just move all your applications over to and not have to, again, buy a big server outright and manage it.
I'll be honest first and say that I've not seen them in the wild. I've certainly read some of the white papers. I don't know if Dave, maybe you have some experience with those.
I have not seen them in the wild personally. I know some people that have worked on the applications, but have not had like in-depth conversations as to what it looks like when they went through the hyperconvergence or the hyperscaling. I guess on my side, I think it's really interesting. Personally, I think that if we can remove a bunch of the, hey, it's got to be, X, Y, and Z, and that is our hardware stack, it's only going to be beneficial for what we are doing as an industry, and kind of my vision of what I imagine everything is going to look like moving forward. But as Vlad knows, it is a very infrequent thing in which I get a group that says, hey, we want to go kind of rip out everything, or Dave, let's go help us kind of greenfield the next 5 or 10 facilities and be able to go do that. So I know some people who have worked for very large companies who are at least have been involved in those conversations. I don't know how it's gone. Have you been involved in one of those, Joseph? Do you have kind of some firsthand experience that you can share without potentially violating NDAs?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've had some companies that want to do it in a gradual way, and it's also, I know with our platforms, for example, our initial MVP, if you will, was to say we're just going to put a little edge device in the plants inside of a control panel, collect data, and we're going to have everything up in the cloud. And one of the first companies we talked to, who was a larger manufacturing company, said, well, that's great. You guys can provide this this vertical slice, if you will, but I've got all these legacy applications. And if I don't have a strategy for incorporating those into a migration, I can't just, to your point, Dave, I can't just rip and replace all of that. These applications have to live somewhere. And if I can get, this great version controlling and these great backups for this slice of my SCADA application, what about all this other stuff? And so we kind of circled back and said, well, you know what? It's not realistic, to our conversation earlier, to say, well, we're going to, move everything out of the plants. We're going to put everything in the cloud. But to look for sort of a hybrid, which is what it's called, but also sort of an intermediate step where, well, let's start looking at consolidation and let's keep these legacy applications around. And for example, be able to install, agents on these to monitor uptime. So, hey, maybe we don't know the nuances of these applications, but we can tell you if they're accessible or not. We can tell you if they're running or not. We can tell you if the OS that's running on them needs patches, and we can manage all and monitor all that centrally, and then work with customers on plans to move up. And then, of course, when these opportunities for capital projects come up, or when they have the ability to, let's say in our case, adopt Ignition and maybe, get rid of an older SCADA platform, they can start to adopt more and more of this when they see the benefits of, again, version control and backups and infrastructure as code and all these things we're able to do. But certainly not everybody is there yet, and some companies have said, well, I don't want to touch this yet, and that's probably going to be the case for the foreseeable future, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say,
Go ahead.
so Rob is in the comments saying that Stratus is utilized in oil and gas mainly for edge data collection, MQTT, I think Sparkplug B, and on-site AI and data transformation. So I have I guess I have not done the work myself, but I have heard of similar applications from folks I know, and I think it's interesting. And like in many cases, I think the oil and gas industry, when they've got a bunch of money, can absolutely help lead towards kind of what the next generation and the next generation solutions look like. We've got some more comments that I want to read, but first, we've got some people to thank. So for this, we want to thank Siemens for sponsoring the IT/OT convergence theme and for your continued support of the community. So decisions are made based upon data. Data is the new gold of the 21st century, but most of the data within a factory is lost due to poor connectivity between the different levels of OT and IT. OT and IT are often two different worlds and maybe or maybe not incompletely connected with each other. If you want to be ready for the future, the basis must be set today. Siemens totally integrated automation solutions for smart production can help drive you closer to your digital transformation goals while maintaining a robust industrial cybersecurity system. Learn more today by visiting siemens.com/digital-enterprise. That's siemens.com/digital-enterprise. We will have that link down below. I think cybersecurity is an important point, and if you guys missed episode 96 with Kyle McMillan, Kyle was actually on talking all about cybersecurity, and especially as we look at putting things in the cloud, or maybe as we look at doing just about anything. I don't think that cybersecurity has ever been less important, and it will certainly be towards the top of everyone's important lists. Speaking of cybersecurity, Toby in the comments is saying one of the things that you hear is right away, and that many OT folks don't know about the cloud architecture. It can also be segmented and controlled kind of based upon the customer needs. And she also says a lot of the pushbacks about not ever being able to do cloud backups is due to IP speeds and explaining how the connectivity is good. And to Joseph's earlier point, I think that cloud backups are a really good opportunity, even if we just want to throw a data diode on there and it's just one way up to the cloud, and it only pulls at, I don't know, midnight, or we only pull some slice during the 5-10 minutes either before or after shift handover. There are lots of good opportunities to go make sure that you are backed up, because more often than not, if there's a issue and I don't know, we lose code on the PLC or something along those lines, in my mind, it's always a like wet cardboard box or bottom filing cabinet bottom filing cabinet drawer that someone is going to look for, or more reasonably, it's frantic phone calls to the systems integrator, whoever was last in the PLC, to say, hey, do you guys have a backup of this? Because maybe we lost it, and maybe the thumb drive or the CD-ROM or whatever that we had copies of, they went bad because we haven't looked at it in 10 years. So we're hoping that you have something. So I think all of those absolutely good points. Sean has got a question actually for Joseph. He wants to know how you deal with the licensing for the development, test, production virtual OT servers. I imagine that this is a normal conversation that you get to have, Joseph.
Yep. No, it's a great question. I wanted to echo too your point about going to an SI to get backups of programs is something we've seen all the time. Copia is actually a company which you guys might be familiar with that automates some of that, which I'm not affiliated with, but a big fan of. So it's nice to see again these IT technologies making their way into the OT space. And I mean, version control has been done since the 70s, if you will, in the IT world. So it's not a new thing. To the question, it's a great one. So the core of our current offering with Factory Stack is built around Ignition. And so Ignition has basically a 2-hour free trial when you download it and run it yourself. However, they also offer, which folks maybe don't know, is they have development and test instances. And those are available at a discount, basically 50% discount off the list price. So if you're, for example, wanting to have a subscription where I want to have, let's say, a production system that's obviously always running, and then I want one or more additional instances that I want to do development work on or testing or staging. If you want those to be what we call long-running instances or long-running environments, then you can get basically discounted licenses for those servers from Inductive. If you want to just, hey, I'm going to we could have a whole conversation about version control, but I'm going to, generate a new branch of my code to run a quick test, and then I'm going to spin it down. Then you can usually get away with the trial, and that is, commercially acceptable, if you will, to inductive. And I will say too, with Cloud Edition coming out, which you guys might be may or may not be aware of, they're also moving to a consumption-based licensing. So depending on how that's deployed, you will basically pay, per hour, if you will, for a license. And then when you're not using it anymore, that'll kind of go away. So that's going to change the discussion a little bit. But currently, 2-hour free trial, and then your 50% discount on dev and test licenses. Great question.
Interesting. I will throw out Adam Gluck. Joseph mentioned Copia. Adam Gluck, episode 28. We actually spent 4 episodes, 28, 29, 30, and 31, talking all about industrial DevOps. Things have changed a little bit. DevOps is more of a kind of household name now than it was, I don't know, like a year and a half ago when we had those initial conversations. But absolutely go take a listen to those. Yeah, absolutely go take a listen to those if you want to dig into DevOps and DevOps for automation.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I guess no, it's very interesting. Again, I really think that a lot more manufacturers will start migrating this way. I think that we're going to see more and more deployments in the cloud, certainly using Ignition. I think that other manufacturers, again, we can maybe not name all of them, are starting to come out with their own offerings that are going to be more cloud-based, right? And I think we also on the license management side as well. Joseph, if I can maybe ask you, do you have can you walk us through, again, like I think we discussed a little bit what the stack typically looks like, right? So you would be deploying some kind of an edge device that would be used as a funnel. What does that typically look like, right? So if you go and assess a factory, do you select the hardware? Do you help them? Again, does that look like an IPCs, data servers, that an Opto22 controller, right? Like what does that look like so you can aggregate ultimately the data, then be able to tunnel that into the cloud application? And I'm also curious, again, the dynamic on the IT side, right? Does the IT become then your partner to help you secure sort of like that tunnel, so to speak? What is their involvement in maintaining that edge device? Is that something that OT typically, is responsible for? Is that IT? Like what's, the delineation between maybe the two?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to unwrap it, and maybe you can help guide me in the direction. So we have, and the reality is that we can't have a one size fits all solution for manufacturers because they're so different. I mean, some of the companies we work with are basically a bunch of PhDs running around in lab coats, right? So like biotech companies who they don't have IT folks on staff. They want as much managed as possible and to have all that stuff running in the cloud. Usually what we see is there is an edge device requirement. Some companies have their own. We found is the easiest for, let's say, smaller workloads is to deploy something like the Opto22 Groove Epic, which is a great hybrid. You guys have had Benson on before, I know, but it's a great hybrid PLC industrial PC device. And so as a part of our offering as an option, we let you basically lease those. And then built into the Epic is an OpenVPN client and server. So we actually have the ability to selectively, and we'll get into the security piece in a second, but to, access that controller to do things like firmware upgrades, to do backups of projects on there, and to do configuration remotely. And then we will basically manage that as a part of our managed service. So that's an option. And that's really good if a customer doesn't have existing PLCs, or they want to just throw, an analog or a digital, IO card on there and sample some points. It's all kind of in one place. Other companies will have their own existing IT infrastructure. So they've invested in some of these HyperConverged boxes like I talked about, or they've already got an industrial server. And we'll basically ask them to carve off a slice of that we can then manage and run our applications on. And so there's no additional capital investment of hardware. They will obviously manage the hardware itself, but we will basically provide, we set up similar to what you do with an actual cloud provider. They have these shared responsibility models. So you set up your line of demarcation. We're going to handle this. You're going to handle this. That's another option that we have. And one that's been more popular, which I was alluding to, is some of these devices that are basically leased directly from the cloud providers, like an Azure Stack Edge, which they will pay for that directly to the
Mhm.
cloud provider. So they'll pay Microsoft or AWS for that, and then we basically run our stuff on that and do it that way. So at some level, though, again, because we're talking manufacturing, we're talking about uptime being critical. You have some device that's going to allow you to do store and forward.
Hmm.
And also, this is a really nice feature as well, is depending on your application. So if you're just doing data collection, all you care about is store and forward, that's great. But a lot of companies are running basically distributed SCADA systems. So they may have a recipe system, for example, and they want to be able to have some level of visibility of that, in the cloud. And maybe they don't want multiple ignition projects that they have to kind of manage. So what you could also do is basically have a full-blown ignition project that's running on that edge device or on that hyperconverged infrastructure or on that server. And ignition in particular is basically aware of connectivity. So if it loses connectivity, you could actually fail over and run locally. So you're never going to be in a situation where I can't, stop my motor or open my valve because I don't have internet connectivity. So you have that
Mhm.
as kind of a failover. And then kind of moving up that stack, you need some kind of a secure tunnel into the cloud. So we have two options that we support. And of course, the cloud providers have their own, but basically using a VPN is kind of the preferred way to go. And the Opto 22 Group Epic, as I mentioned, has an open VPN client. So we'll support typically open VPN connectivity. What's nice about that, to your guys' point, is that there's usually, it kind of minimizes the interfacing we tend to have to do with IT folks there at the site, because they don't have to install or configure anything, right? It's an outbound only connection that comes from the four walls of the plant, goes up to the cloud, which is the piece that we manage. We also have the ability to basically set up an IPsec tunnel. And in those scenarios, that's where we'll be working with the IT folks in the plants. And we work with a big enterprise where we worked with their IT folks because that was their standard, is they're only going to use, IPsec tunnels. So, and then we set up the the connection, we configure all the routes to make that kind of happen. And then again, once it gets up to the cloud, that's something that we're all managing. But what's important I mean, we could have a whole discussion, I'm sure you guys have, around security. That's obviously critical. So at a very foundational building block level, we make sure that all traffic going into and out of the plant is encrypted first and foremost, and that it's transmitted over a secure channel like a VPN, for example.
Mhm.
So hopefully that gives you kind of
Interesting.
an overlay of the land there.
And so on that edge device, you mentioned, I guess, a couple of things. So you can certainly run ignition, but you can also run other applications that might be of interest, right? And so you said like recipe management, but you can also control locally. Could you paint us a picture, I guess, like what's typically running on those edge devices? It's also, you run some kind of a MQTT client that you're sending your data upstream. Like what does that look like?
Yeah. So on the Opto 22 Group Epic, for example, so that comes basically pre-installed with Ignition.